Nick Saban's success at Alabama really all started during the 2008 season. It was Nick Saban's second year at Alabama, and the Tide went 12-2 after losing their final two games of the year. The Tide were ranked number one in the country, headed into the SEC title game, where they ultimately lost to a great Florida Gators squad. Following that loss, they were placed in the Sugar Bowl against an undefeated Utah team. While it was competitive, they lost that game 31-17 to end their season. Headed into the 2009 season, the expectations around Tuscaloosa were off the charts. They were the preseason number 5 team in the country, behind the likes of Florida, Texas, Oklahoma, and USC. A big part of that preseason hype was due to the recruiting classes in years prior. The 2009 class was no exception, as they brought in the number 3 class overall, headlined by guys like Trent Richardson, A.J. McCarron, and Dre Kirkpatrick. Not to mention two of the most underrated players of the Nick Saban era, and linebacker Nico Johnson and wide receiver Kevin Norwood. Along with the great recruiting class, Alabama returned a ton of talent. The headline returners were Mark Ingram and Julio Jones on the offensive side of the ball. On defense, they had Javier Arenas and Rolando McClain, two of the best players Nick Saban ever had on defense. They had some really good players on the offensive line, including James Carpenter and Barrett Jones. A position where there were some question marks was quarterback. Greg McElroy was stepping in at quarterback for John Parker Wilson. The pieces around him were so good that all Greg McElroy had to do was just not lose the team games with his inexperience. It's safe to say he did his job. Week 1, Alabama opened their 2009 season in prime time against 7th-ranked Virginia Tech. Many people thought Virginia Tech could pull off the upset due to their talented quarterback, Tyrod Taylor. That was not the case, as college football was introduced to the best defense in the game. The Kirby Smart-led defense held the Hokies to just 155 total yards, and Virginia Tech only had 10 first downs, while Alabama tallied 22 of their own and put up 500 total yards. Led by Mark Ingram, who rushed for 150 yards and 2 total touchdowns, Alabama won the game by 10 with a score of 34-24, and they did so while having 10 penalties and 2 turnovers. It's safe to say this was a statement game for Nick Saban and the 2009 Alabama team. Following their big win over Virginia Tech, Alabama moved up in the polls to number 4, but they got some help from Oklahoma, who lost to BYU in their season opener. Over the next 2 games, Alabama played FIU and North Texas. 2 games they dominated from start to finish. The Tide beat FIU by a score of 40-14 and North Texas 53-7. Nothing more to say on those games other than Alabama took care of business. Week 4 was when Alabama started conference play, as they hosted a 1-1 Arkansas team. Alabama once again dominated this game from start to finish, as they won 35-7. Defensively, they held Arkansas to 63 rushing yards on just 26 carries. Offensively, Alabama struggled to move the ball at the beginning of this game, but they got things going early in the second quarter. Overall, they outgained the Razorbacks 425-254. Following the Arkansas game, they went on the road to play a 2-1 Kentucky team. At the time, Alabama moved up to number 3 in the polls, but this game against Kentucky wasn't as dominant as the final score may show. For the first time this season, Alabama allowed more first downs on defense than their own offense gained. While only having 50 more total yards than the Wildcats, a bright spot was Mark Ingram. He ran wild when the passing offense was still trying to figure it out. Now moving on to Week 6, Alabama was facing their first major road test of the season. They traveled to Oxford to take on the 20th-ranked Ole Miss Rebels. Let's just say, Alabama woke up for this game and dominated the Rebels in all areas. Offensively, Mark Ingram once again ran wild for 172 yards and a touchdown. The story of the game was Alabama's defense, who forced 5 turnovers, and 4 different players on that defense had an interception. Led by Kareem Jackson, he had a 76-yard interception return to set up an Alabama score, and they held Ole Miss below 200 total yards, and Nick Saban, Kirby Smart reminded college football just how dominant their defense could be. Next up, Alabama took on a ranked South Carolina squad with a 5-1 record. This was a game where just about everything went wrong for Alabama, but they responded every single time. If I told you that Alabama won this game by 14 while having 4 turnovers and 10 penalties, would you believe me? Well, that's how good this team was. They quite literally beat themselves more than South Carolina did. The passing game looked really bad for the first time, and people questioned if Alabama could win a title with Greg McElroy. While Greg went 10 for 20 for 92 yards and 2 interceptions despite the win. A big part of that was Mark Ingram once again dominating the football game. He ran for 246 yards while averaging 10 yards per carry. Week 8 arrived and Alabama rose to number 1 in the polls. That number 1 ranking grabbed the attention of many, including the 3-3 Tennessee Volunteers. The Tide were huge favorites, as many of you would expect, but this ended up being the closest win of the season for Alabama. Both offenses struggled, as Tennessee couldn't run the ball, while Alabama really couldn't throw it. It was a defensive masterclass by both teams, where almost all the points were scored by kickers. With all of that being said, there was one man who saved Alabama and kept them undefeated. Defensive lineman Terrence Cody had 2 blocked field goals in this game, both of them coming in the fourth quarter. Cody blocked the game-winning field goal attempt as time expired, ending Tennessee's upset bid in Tuscaloosa. The final score here was 12-10. Shout out Terrence Cody for blocking those 2 kicks. Week 10, following a bye in Week 9, Alabama dropped to number 3 in the polls as they prepared for their biggest game of the season to date. They welcomed the one-loss LSU Tiger team into Bryant-Denny Stadium, and heading into this game, remember, Alabama was struggling to throw the ball while also playing clean. Not sure if it was the bye week, but Alabama woke up and got back to their standard. They put up 452 yards on offense against a very good LSU defense, with 276 of those yards coming through the air, and Julio Jones had a great game, putting up 102 yards and a touchdown. Defensively, Marcel Darius dominated as usual, while Orlando McClain racked up 10 total tackles. The Tide totally shut down the Tiger offense and won the game 24-15, giving Nick Saban yet another huge win. Following their big win against LSU, Alabama had 2 consecutive games against teams they were expected to dominate. They did just that, beating Mississippi State 31-3 behind Mark Ingram's 149 rushing yards and Mark Barron's 2 interceptions. The following week, they played Chattanooga and won the game 45-0. This was a game where Alabama got a lot of young guys and backups in to get very much needed experience. Nonetheless, Alabama moved to 11-0 on the season, ahead of their big game against Auburn in the Iron Bowl. Now, Auburn wasn't a special team this year, nor were they expected to beat Alabama. The Tigers also weren't a team you could overlook despite their 7-4 record. Alabama found that out very quickly as the Tigers jumped out to a 14-0 lead at the end of the first quarter. That first quarter was no doubt a wake-up call to Alabama, as from that point on they dominated the Tigers, outscoring them 26-7. In a game where Mark Ingram struggled, fellow running back Trent Richardson answered the call, having 75 total yards. Greg McElroy also stepped up and threw for 218 yards and 2 touchdowns. This game, along with the Tennessee game, was very important for what this Alabama team became at the end of the year. Finding ways to win when facing adversity is what the best teams do. Speaking of great teams, that's exactly what we had in the SEC Championship. Alabama was matched up with the number 1 undefeated defending national champ, Florida Gators. Florida was led by quarterback Tim Tebow and head coach Urban Meyer. The Gators were looking to go for back-to-back national titles and 3 in the last 4 years. But the one team standing in their way was an Alabama team led by head coach Nick Saban. As you would expect, this game was tight at the beginning as both teams came ready to play on defense, with a halftime score of just 19-13. Alabama felt pretty good having the lead, and the second half plan was really to rely on Mark Ingram and Trent Richardson, let them bring home the SEC title. Sadly for Florida, the Tide executed that plan to perfection. The duo finished with 193 yards and 3 total touchdowns, averaging just over 5 yards per carry. Alabama racked up nearly 500 yards of offense and held Florida to just 13 first downs, winning the game 32-13. Looking back, many people believe this was the turning point for Nick Saban as he took the SEC from Florida and stamped the Tide as the premier program in college football. As good as that game felt for Coach Saban and all Alabama fans beating the Florida Gators, the job was not finished. Next up was the Texas Longhorns. Led by Coach Mack Brown and quarterback Colt McCoy, everyone knows how this game went at the beginning. Texas quarterback Colt McCoy, he left the game early in the first quarter due to injury, and he would not return. Many people believe this is the sole reason Alabama won the title that night. Obviously, you hate to see a player get hurt like that on the biggest stage, but injuries happen, and Colt McCoy wasn't playing defense. Greg McElroy threw for just 58 yards in this game, and there was nothing wrong with that because Trent Richardson and Mark Ingram once again took over in the biggest moments, leading the Tide to victory. The duo combined for 227 yards and 4 touchdowns, averaging 5.5 yards per carry. Marcel Darius also had an amazing game, capped off with a pick 6 of Garrett Gilbert. Along with Darius, Javier Arenas had 2 interceptions himself. Alabama went on to win this game 37-21 and ultimately started the greatest dynasty in the history of college football. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to press the like button, as I will be doing more videos just like this, choosing different teams from the last 20 years. And before you guys head out, be sure to hit that subscribe button as we're on the road to 1,000. It's greatly appreciated. With that being said, I'll see y'all in the next video.